Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the symphony of clinking glasses and forced laughter. She watched her husband Julian lean in close to a woman who was not her, his smile a secret she was no longer privy to. And then she saw it, a flash of brilliant, predatory yellow on the woman's finger, a 4-carat canary diamond catching the ballroom light and reflecting it back as a declaration of war. The Mistress Chloe was flaunting her prize. In that moment, Elara knew her quiet life was over. But what Chloe and Julian didn't know was that Elara wasn't just a wife. She was a daughter, and she was about to make a phone call that would turn their entire world to ash. The annual Vanguard Corporation Gala was the glittering pinnacle of the New York corporate calendar. It was an evening designed to project power, a sea of bespoke tuxedos and couture gowns, swimming in a ballroom at the Pierre Hotel, overlooking Central Park. For Elara Hayes, it had always felt less like a celebration and more like a performance. She was the wife of Julian Hayes, Vanguard's fastest-rising senior vice president. Her role was simple: be elegant, be quiet, and be a beautiful, unobtrusive accessory on his arm. Tonight, the performance was becoming unbearable. Julian hadn't truly looked at her, since they'd arrived. His attention was a commodity he distributed to his superiors, to potential clients, and most alarmingly, to Chloe Sterling. Chloe was a junior analyst in his division, with ambition that burned as brightly and artificially as the diamond studs in her ears. She was all sharp angles from her platinum bob to her stiletto heels, and her laughter was a high, piercing thing that cut through the ballroom's decorous hum. Elara smoothed the silk of her deep sapphire gown, a custom piece by a designer friend that Julian had called a bit too artistic. She felt a familiar pang of invisibility as she watched him across the table, his body angled towards Chloe. They were sharing a joke, their heads close together. Elara took a slow sip of her champagne, the bubbles fizzing uselessly against the cold knot in her stomach. Their marriage had been dying a slow death for years. It wasn't a sudden, violent event, but a gradual cooling like an engine seizing up from neglect. Julian, once the charming, driven man who had been fascinated by her quiet life as a painter, now saw her art as a cute hobby. He resented the time she spent in her studio, a sun-drenched loft in Soho that she paid for with a small trust fund left by her grandmother. He saw it as a distraction from her real job, supporting his ascent. "Elara, darling, you're 1,000 miles away," came the syrupy voice of Julian's boss's wife, a woman perpetually draped in Chanel. Elara forced a smile. "Just admiring the decor, Martha. It's breathtaking this year." It was a lie. She was watching Chloe, who had just risen from her seat and was making her way around the table, ostensibly to chat with another colleague. Her path, however, seemed deliberately designed to end beside Elara. "Elara, that's a stunning dress," Chloe said, her voice dripping with insincere sweetness. She leaned forward, placing her hand on the back of Elara's chair for balance. It was a calculated, deliberate movement. And there it was. The ring. It wasn't a subtle piece of jewelry. It was a statement. A magnificent cushion-cut canary yellow diamond, at least 4 carats, set in a platinum pavé band. It was audacious, expensive, and screamingly new. It sat on the ring finger of her left hand. Elara's own wedding set, a classic and elegant platinum band with a single perfect 2-carat diamond, suddenly felt small and insignificant. Chloe saw her staring. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. "Oh, this old thing," she said, feigning surprise as she wiggled her fingers, making the diamond dance in the chandelier light. "Julian has the most exquisite taste, don't you think?" he insisted, a little bonus for a project well done. The lie was so bald-faced, so insulting in its transparency that it took Ilara's breath away. A company bonus, was a wire transfer, not a Van Cleef & Arpels engagement-style ring. Julian's eyes met Ilara's from across the table. There was no apology in them, no remorse. There was only a cold, defiant challenge. He was daring her to make a scene. The air around Ilara grew thin and sharp. The chatter of the ballroom faded into a dull roar. The knot in her stomach tightened into a block of ice. She could feel the stares of the others at their table, the poorly concealed smirks and pitying glances. They all knew. Of course they all knew. She was the last to find out, the clueless, artistic wife. Chloe's smile widened. She had won. In the brutal social hierarchy of Vanguard Corp, she had just publicly staked her claim. This ring wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol of Ilara's replacement. For a moment, Ilara felt the sting of tears, the hot shame that threatened to boil over. She wanted to shrink, to run from the ballroom and disappear back into the safety of her studio. But then something else sparked within her, a flicker of cold, long-dormant fury. It wasn't the fury of a scorned wife. It was something older, deeper, a legacy she had spent her entire adult life trying to escape. She looked at Julian's smug face, at Chloe's triumphant smirk. They thought she was a nobody, a quiet artist with a small inheritance who had lucked into marrying a man on the rise. They had no idea who she was. They had no idea what her last name truly meant. Ilara met Chloe's gaze, her expression unreadable. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she slowly and deliberately placed her napkin on the table, stood up, and looked at Julian. "Excuse me," she said, her voice impossibly calm. "I need to make a phone call." Ilara walked away from the table with a grace she did not feel. Each step was a battle against the trembling in her legs. She could feel the weight of every eye in that room on her back, a physical pressure of pity and morbid curiosity. Julian's smugness, Chloe's victorious gleam. They were brands seared into her mind. She didn't head for the chaos of the main lobby or the chattering crowd in the ladies' powder room. Instead, she found a deserted corridor leading to the hotel's administrative offices. The air suddenly cool and smelling of industrial cleaner and quiet efficiency. She leaned against the cool marble wall, the silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of her thoughts. The humiliation was a physical entity, a coiling serpent in her gut. For 7 years, she had tried to build a life on her own terms. A life where her value wasn't tied to her family's name, where her art was her identity, not her father's fortune. She had fallen in love with Julian Hayes precisely because he knew her only as Ilara Thompson, the name she'd taken from her mother. He was ambitious and saw in her a quiet, supportive partner, not a financial dynasty. Or so she had thought. Now she saw the bitter truth: he hadn't loved her for being ordinary. He had simply capitalized on her lack of complication. Her simplicity had made her easily discardable. Her hand shook as she pulled her phone from her clutch. There was only one number she needed to dial, a number she hadn't used for a personal emergency in over a decade. It was a direct, private line, one that bypassed secretaries and assistants. The phone rang only once before a familiar voice, calm and impossibly deep, answered. "Ilara." It wasn't a question. He always knew it was her. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice cracking. for the first time. The single word carried the weight of years of unspoken pain and the fresh, raw wound of tonight's betrayal. There was a pause on the other end, not of impatience but of acute analytical listening. "What's wrong? Where are you?" "The Pierre Hotel, the Vanguard Corporation Gala." She took a shaky breath. "Julian, he's having an affair. He gave her a ring, Dad, in front of everyone. A huge yellow diamond. She flaunted it in my face." She didn't need to say more. She didn't need to explain the nuances of the public humiliation, the social execution she had just endured. Her father, Alistair Vance, understood the world of power and symbolism better than anyone. He didn't deal in emotions. He dealt in leverage, consequences, and the swift, merciless application of pressure. "I see," Alistair said. The two words were colder than the marble against her back. In that simple phrase, Julian Hayes's career, his reputation and his future were tried, judged and sentenced. "Is the CEO of Vanguard, Marcus Thorne, in attendance?" "Yes, he's here." "Good, stay where you are. I'm 20 minutes away." "Dad, you don't have to—" She started a reflexive attempt to downplay the situation, to retreat back into her self-sufficient shell. "Elara," he interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "He brought this war to my daughter's feet. He will learn the catastrophic error of choosing the wrong enemy. I will be there in 15. The line went dead. 15 minutes. He had corrected his own ETA, shaving off 5 minutes through sheer force of will. Elara slid down the wall, her sapphire gown pooling around her on the floor. The fury that had propelled her from the table was now replaced by a chilling certainty. The storm was coming. She had spent her life running from the shadow of Alistair Vance, the founder and CEO of Vance Global, a titan of industry whose net worth was a subject of speculation in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. His name opened doors and ended careers. She had wanted Julian to love her Elara the painter, not Elara Vance, the heiress to a multi-billion-dollar empire. She had gotten her wish, and in doing so she had rendered herself worthless in his eyes. Composing herself, she stood up and walked back towards the ballroom. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to watch. She slipped back to the table just as the string quartet was beginning a new piece. Julian shot her a venomous look, a mix of anger at her departure and annoyance at her return. "Feeling better?" he sneered under his breath. Chloe smirked, twisting the yellow diamond on her finger. "Probably needed a moment to cry. It must be so difficult realizing your time is up." Elara didn't respond. She simply picked up her champagne flute, her hand now perfectly steady, and took a sip. She looked at Julian, at his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo and the Patek Philippe watch she had bought him for their 5th anniversary. She looked at Chloe in her garish, glittering dress, clutching the ring that was meant to be her new crown. They were like children playing with matches in a dynamite factory, and they had no idea she had just lit the fuse. She settled into her chair, a silent observer at her own husband's execution. The clock was ticking. 14 minutes. The atmosphere in the ballroom at the Pierre was one of self-congratulatory excess. Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Vanguard Corp., was on the stage delivering a speech filled with corporate platitudes about synergy and forward momentum. Julian was listening with rapt attention, his face a mask of ambition. Chloe was gazing at him with undisguised adoration, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Elara watched the main doors. 13 minutes after her call, the grand double doors of the ballroom swung open. It wasn't a loud entrance. There was no announcement. But a sudden, perceptible shift occurred in the room's energy. It started as a murmur near the entrance, a ripple of whispers that quickly spread, overpowering the CEO's speech. Two men entered first, dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits, with earpieces that were almost invisible. They weren't hotel security. They moved with the quiet, predatory economy of professional bodyguards, their eyes scanning the room with a detached, comprehensive gaze. Then he walked in. Alistair Vance was not a physically imposing man, but he possessed a gravitational pull that bent the room around him. In his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a sharp, intelligent face, he moved with the unshakable confidence of a man who owned continents. He was dressed in a simple, dark Brioni suit that likely cost more than the car Julian drove. He didn't look at anyone in particular, yet everyone felt seen and judged. Marcus Thorne, mid-sentence, faltered. His eyes widened first in disbelief, then in a panic that bordered on reverence. "Alistair Vance," he stammered into the microphone, the name dropping into the now silent ballroom like a stone. He abandoned his speech and practically sprinted from the stage, his face flushed. "Alistair. What an incredible, unexpected honor." Thorne gushed, reaching Alistair and extending a hand that was visibly trembling. Alistair ignored the hand. His cold, pale blue eyes, the only feature Alara had inherited from him, swept the room until they found her. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before turning his chilling gaze upon the CEO. "Thorne," Alistair said, his voice quiet, yet carrying across the silent hall. "I was under the impression this was a reputable event, not a Roman circus where employees are publicly humiliated." At their table, Julian had gone rigid. His face, moments before alight with ambition, was now a slack-jawed mask of confusion and dawning horror. He knew who Alistair Vance was. Everyone in their world knew. The founder of Vance Global was a legend, a phantom of the corporate world, who rarely made public appearances. What was he doing here, and why was he looking at their table with such undisguised contempt? Chloe, oblivious, leaned towards Julian. "Wow, that's Alistair Vance," she whispered, starstruck. "Do you think we can get an introduction?" Julian didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to connect the impossible dots. Vance. Vance. Why was that name so familiar? He looked at Alara. Truly looked at her for the first time all night. She was sitting perfectly still, her expression serene, watching the scene unfold. And then he saw it. The same sharp, intelligent jawline, the same piercing, ice-blue eyes. The blood drained from his face. Alara Thompson, the name she used for her art, her mother's maiden name, the name he had married. But her father whom she never spoke of, the man she described as being in global logistics. It couldn't be. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Alistair, with Marcus Thorne trailing behind him like a nervous page boy, began walking towards their table. The crowd parted before him as if by divine command. The string quartet had long since fallen silent. The only sound was the soft tread of Alistair's leather shoes on the marble floor. He stopped beside Alara's chair, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. He didn't look at her, but the gesture was clear. "This is mine. You have offended this." He then turned his full attention to the man sitting opposite her. His voice was soft, conversational, which made it all the more terrifying. "Julian Hayes," Alistair stated. It wasn't a question. "I believe you are married to my daughter." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Every guest, from the junior accountants to the board members, was frozen witnessing a public execution far more brutal than the one Chloe had attempted moments earlier. Chloe's jaw dropped. Her hand flew to her mouth, the canary diamond on her finger, now feeling less like a trophy and more like a shackle. His daughter. The quiet, boring, artistic wife was the daughter of the legendary Alistair Vance. It was impossible. A nightmare. Julian looked as if he was about to be physically sick. He tried to stand to say something, but his limbs wouldn't obey. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. Alistair's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to the gaudy ring on Chloe's hand, a flicker of utter disgust. He then looked back at Julian, a predator contemplating its prey. "You have made, Alistair Vance," said his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "A grave and catastrophic miscalculation." The world had shrunk to the space around their table. The hundreds of guests were just a gallery of blurred, silent faces. Alistair Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power was a palpable force, a low-frequency hum of absolute authority that had brought the entire gala to a standstill. He turned his gaze from Julian to Marcus Thorne, the sweating, terrified CEO of Vanguard. "Thorne, is it company policy at Vanguard to allow your senior management to conduct their sordid affairs so publicly? Does your board approve of your executives using company funds to purchase trinkets for their mistresses?" Thorne paled. "Alistair, I assure you I had no idea. This is not Vanguard, does not condone this kind of behavior. Not at all." "I should hope not," Alistair said smoothly, his eyes locking back onto Julian, "because my family office will be initiating a full forensic audit of your division's discretionary spending accounts first thing in the morning. I am intensely curious to see how a bonus for a project well done is categorized in your accounting software." Julian finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate plea. "Mr. Vance, sir, this is a misunderstanding. A terrible misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Alistair replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. He gestured towards Chloe, who looked like she might faint. "You chose to publicly humiliate my daughter. You did so with a woman who works for you in front of your peers and superiors. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a declaration, and I am here to accept it on my daughter's behalf." He then delivered the blow that shattered Julian's world completely. "The prenuptial agreement my legal team insisted upon when you married Elara," Alistair said conversationally. "You did read it, didn't you, Julian? Or did your ambition blind you to the fine print?" Julian stared, uncomprehending. A prenup. Yes, there had been one. Elara had been apologetic about it, saying it was a family formality for the small trust fund from her grandmother. He had his own lawyer glance at it. It seemed standard, protecting her pre-existing assets, the Soho loft, her art, the trust. It seemed insignificant compared to the future earnings he was projecting for himself. "Clause 17, subsection B," Alistair continued, as if reciting a nursery rhyme. "The infidelity clause. In the event of marital infidelity proven by declaration or evidence, all marital assets are immediately forfeit. Any gifts, monetary or physical, given during the marriage are to be returned. Your claim to her assets becomes null and void, and you will be liable for her legal fees. It is quite ironclad." Julian's face was ashen. His entire financial strategy had been built around their combined assets. The down payment on their Upper East Side apartment, the investments, the portfolio, it was all entangled. Now it was Alara's turn. She stood up slowly, her calmness a stark contrast to the chaos erupting around her. She looked not at Julian, but at Chloe, whose face was a mask of terror. The canary diamond, once a symbol of her victory, now seemed to be burning a hole in her finger. "It's a beautiful ring, Chloe," Alara said, her voice clear and steady. "The cut is exquisite. A bit flashy for my taste, but beautiful nonetheless. I assume Julian told you it was a real canary diamond from a reputable jeweler, perhaps Tiffany's or Harry Winston." Chloe nodded dumbly, unable to speak. "He lied," Alara said simply. "That's a high-quality lab-grown moissanite from an online retailer in Delaware. Cost him about $3,000. He paid for it on our joint American Express card 2 weeks ago. I saw the charge. I thought he was buying me an anniversary gift." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not only had he cheated, he had done it on the cheap, using their shared funds to buy a convincing fake for his mistress, while passing it off as a grand gesture. Chloe stared at the ring on her finger, as if it were a venomous spider. The symbol of her triumph was a lie. Her billionaire prize was a fraud. She was just the bargain basement mistress. Alara then held up her own left hand, the simple, elegant 2-carat diamond on her finger, catching the light. "This one," Alara said, her voice ringing with a newfound power she never knew she possessed. "This one is real, and the De Beers mine in Botswana that it came from. My father's holding company, Vance Global, bought a controlling interest in it the year I was born." She let that statement hang in the air, a testament to a level of wealth and power that Julian and Chloe couldn't even begin to comprehend. They weren't just out of their league. They were playing a different sport on a different planet. She turned to Julian, her eyes holding his for the last time. There was no hatred in her gaze, only a profound and weary disappointment. "You wanted a wife who would support your career, Julian. You had one," she said quietly. "You just had no idea whose career you should have been supporting." With that, she turned her back on him. Alistair Vance placed a protective arm around her shoulders. "Thorn," Alistair said, addressing the petrified CEO one last time. "Mr. Hayes's personal effects from his office. Have them couriered to my office by noon tomorrow. He will no longer require access to your building." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Marcus Thorne just nodded vigorously. "Of course, Alistair. Consider it done." Alistair Vance guided his daughter through the silent, parted crowd. As they reached the doors, he paused and looked back at the wreckage. Julian stood alone, a hollowed-out man in a designer suit. Chloe was already slinking away, trying to disappear into the crowd, desperately pulling the fraudulent ring from her finger. The gala was over. The performance was done. And the real world, in all its brutal, unforgiving clarity, had just begun. The ride from the Pierre was silent. They didn't take one of Alistair's fleet of armored sedans. Instead, a discreet town car was waiting, one that blended seamlessly into the New York traffic. Alara stared out the window, the glittering lights of the city blurring past her, each one a distant star in a universe that suddenly felt alien. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache. She hadn't won. There was no victory in the complete annihilation of her marriage, no triumph in the public ruin of the man she had once loved. There was only the grim, sickening finality of it all. They didn't go to her apartment on the Upper East Side, an apartment that was no longer hers, no longer theirs, but to Alistair's private residence. It was a sprawling, full-floor penthouse in a limestone monolith on Park Avenue, a place she had actively avoided for years. It was less a home and more a museum of power, with priceless art on the walls, minimalist furniture, and vast windows offering a godlike view of the city below. Alistair led her into his library. The room was lined with dark mahogany shelves, filled not with books, but with leather-bound volumes of corporate reports and geopolitical analyses. He poured 2 glasses of Macallan 25 neat and handed one to her. "Drink," he said gently. "It will help." She took a sip, the fiery liquid, a welcome shock to her system. She sank into a deep leather armchair that faced the window. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice a near whisper. "Why didn't you tell me you knew he was a fraud?" Alistair swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I ran a full background check on him the week you announced your engagement. I knew about his modest background, his crushing student debt, his naked ambition. I knew he was a social climber of the most transparent variety. Then why did you let me marry him?" The accusation in her voice was soft, laced with pain. "Because you asked me to," he answered simply. "You came to me and said, 'Dad, I've met someone. He doesn't know who we are. He loves me for me.' You were so adamant about building a life separate from the Vance name. To interfere to tell you that the man you loved was likely more interested in the life you could provide than the person you are. That would have proven your worst fear, that my name and my money would always be an insurmountable wall between you and a normal life. It was a lesson you had to learn on your own terms. Though I admit," he added, a flicker of cold anger in his eyes, "I never anticipated he would be foolish enough to be so theatrical in his betrayal." It was the truth. She had fought so hard for her independence, for her anonymity. She had created Elara Thompson as an escape, a way to ensure she was loved for her soul and not her stock portfolio. And that very act of self-preservation had made her a target for a predator like Julian. "The prenup," she murmured. "Was my only condition," Alistair confirmed. "My legal team, led by a very capable young man named Daniel Larson, drafted it. It was designed to protect you in precisely this scenario. Julian saw a small trust fund. We saw a firewall." She closed her eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on her. The lies, the manipulation, her own willful blindness. "I feel so stupid." "You are not stupid, Elara," Alistair said, his voice firm. "You are trusting. In a world of sharks, you chose to be a dolphin. Julian's failing is that he could not tell the difference between a dolphin and a minnow. He will pay for that mistake for the rest of his life." The fallout was swift and brutal. By the next morning, Julian was a pariah. His termination from Vanguard was official before the first stock market bell rang. News of the public spectacle at the gala, fueled by whispers of Alistair Vance's involvement, spread through the city's financial and social circles like wildfire. No firm would touch him. His credit lines were frozen, tied to joint accounts that were now solely under Elara's control. He was locked out of the apartment, his belongings packed into boxes and sent to a storage unit in Queens. Chloe Sterling vanished. Her company email was deactivated. Her LinkedIn profile deleted. She had evaporated from the city, the canary diamond lie likely haunting her every step. Elara spent the next few days in a daze, sheltered in the gilded cage of her father's penthouse. Her lawyer, the Daniel Larson her father had mentioned, handled everything. He was a sharp, empathetic man in his late 30s, with kind eyes and a reassuring calm. He explained the legal proceedings with a clarity that cut through her emotional fog. The divorce would be quick. Julian had no legal ground to stand on. He had already signed away everything in his desperate attempt to marry up. A week after the gala, Daniel met with her in the library. "Julian is trying to make contact," he said carefully. "He's leaving messages. They're desperate. He's claiming the affair was a mistake, that he was trying to end it. Standard cheater's remorse." "I don't want to talk to him," Elara said, her voice flat. "I understand. However, there's a new development," Daniel continued, his expression growing more serious. "He's no longer begging. Now he's threatening. He claims he has information. Something about a Vance global internal project he says he overheard you discussing. He's talking about leverage." Elara frowned. "That's ridiculous. I never discussed my father's business with him." "He seems to believe he has something," Daniel said. "He wants a meeting. He's demanding a settlement. $10 million, he says, in exchange for his silence and a file he claims to possess." A cold dread trickled down Elara's spine. Julian wasn't just a failed husband. He was a cornered animal. And cornered animals were dangerously unpredictable. The quiet aftermath was over. The war had just entered a new, uglier phase. The threat of a secret fool was both ludicrous and terrifying. Julian, in his 7 years as her husband, had been kept at a deliberate, almost surgical distance from the inner workings of Vance Global. Elara herself knew only the broad strokes of her father's empire, the public-facing information, and the family's philanthropic endeavors. The labyrinthine details of his corporate strategy were a world away from her Soho art studio. "It has to be a bluff," Elara insisted, pacing the length of the library. "He's desperate. He's lost everything. This is just a pathetic attempt to extort money." Daniel Larson watched her, his expression thoughtful. "I agree that it's an act of desperation. But desperate men can be clumsy, and clumsiness can cause unintended damage. A baseless accusation, if loud enough, can still stain a reputation. He's not trying to win in a courtroom. He's trying to create a media circus. We need to know what he thinks he has." Alistair, who had been listening from his desk, finally spoke. "Arrange the meeting, Daniel. Elara and you will go. I will not be present. This is Julian's final move on the board, and I want him to play it, thinking he's up against the Queen, not the King." He looked at his daughter. "You need to see this through, Elara. You need to see the man you married for what he truly is, with no illusions left." The meeting was set for a neutral location, a private conference room at a law firm in Midtown, a place with no connection to either Vance or Vanguard. Elara felt a surge of anxiety as she and Daniel rode the elevator up. She hadn't seen Julian since he stood broken and humiliated in the ballroom at the Pierre. He was already there when they entered, sitting at the head of a long, polished table. He looked terrible. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by a rumpled shirt and slacks. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had the frantic, haunted look of a man who hadn't slept in days. But when he saw Elara, a flicker of his old arrogance returned, mixed with a bitter resentment. "Elara," he said, his voice raspy. "I knew you'd come. You were always the reasonable one." "There is nothing reasonable about extortion, Julian," Daniel said, his tone crisp and professional as he placed his briefcase on the table. "You made a claim. We are here to listen to it. You have 5 minutes." Julian flinched at Daniel's dismissive tone. He shot a venomous glare at him before focusing back on Elara. "This isn't about him. This is about us, Elara. About the years we spent together. You can't just throw that all away. Your father, he's a monster. He destroyed me." "You destroyed yourself, Julian," Elara said, her voice steady. The woman who had trembled in the hallway of the hotel was gone. "You lied, you cheated, and you humiliated me. You did that." My father simply held up a mirror. A flicker of rage crossed Julian's face. A mirror. He used a nuclear warhead, but he's not untouchable. Nobody is. He reached down and pulled a slim black USB drive from his pocket, placing it on the table with a theatrical click. "Project Nightingale." He said the words heavy with self-importance. "Sound familiar? A top-secret Vance global initiative. A proprietary logistics algorithm that uses predictive analytics to manipulate shipping routes, creating artificial scarcity in emerging markets to drive up prices. Highly unethical, possibly illegal. I have internal memos, project outlines, emails between senior executives." Elara stared at him bewildered. She had never heard of Project Nightingale. It sounded like something out of a spy thriller. "How could you possibly have access to something like that?" Daniel asked, his voice skeptical. "Elara talks in her sleep," Julian said with a greasy smile. "Names, phrases. She mentioned it a few months ago. Nightingale is failing." Just a mumble. It piqued my curiosity, so I hired a private investigator, a specialist in corporate data recovery. He managed to access a temporarily unsecured server during a system migration at Vance Global. It was a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, but he got it. Everything is on this drive. He pushed the USB drive across the table. $10 million, a clean break, and this disappears forever. If not, he let the threat hang in the air. I'm sure the SEC and the Wall Street Journal would be very interested in how the great Alistair Vance really makes his fortune. Elara felt a chill. Was it possible? Could her father be involved in something so corrupt? Had her quiet artistic life been funded by such ruthless practices? The foundation of her world felt shaky. Julian was a liar and a cheat, but the confidence with which he presented his evidence was unnerving. Daniel Larson, however, remained impassive. He didn't look at the drive. He looked at Julian. "Let me be clear, Mr. Hayes," Daniel said slowly. "You are admitting to commissioning an act of corporate espionage against Vance Global. You are in possession of what you claim is stolen proprietary data, and you are now attempting to use that stolen data to extort $10 million from my client. Are you fully aware of the federal crimes you have just confessed to?" Julian's smug expression faltered. "It's not extortion. It's a settlement. A fair price for my silence." "We have a different term for it," Daniel said, his voice hardening. "Now this meeting is over. We will take your proposal under advisement. You will hear from us within 24 hours. Daniel stood up and gestured for Elara to do the same. They left the conference room without a backward glance, leaving Julian sitting alone at the long table with his single piece of leverage, the small black drive that held his last desperate hope. As the elevator doors closed, Elara turned to Daniel, her heart pounding. "Is it real? Could any of that be true?" Daniel looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than professional calm in his eyes. It was a look of profound, almost weary pity, but it wasn't directed at her. "The lie Julian told in that room," Daniel said quietly, "was far more complex and self-destructive than he could ever possibly imagine." The 24 hours that followed the meeting were not a period of quiet waiting, but a crucible of torment for Elara. She roamed the cavernous penthouse like a ghost, the silence of the space amplifying the riot in her mind. Sleep was a foreign country she could not enter. At 3 a.m, she found herself standing before a vast window in the main salon, the city a sprawling galaxy of indifferent lights below. This was her father's view, a conqueror's vista. But tonight it felt like an indictment. Julian's betrayal had been a sharp, clean wound, a personal agony that had shattered her heart. This felt different. This was a potential poison in the bloodline, a corruption that threatened to invalidate her entire existence. The accusation of Project Nightingale echoed in the pristine quiet of the apartment. Was this perfect ordered world built on the chaos and suffering of others in unseen corners of the globe? The question was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She thought of her Soho studio, her sanctuary of canvas and color. She had always believed her art was pure, an expression of a truth separate from her family's wealth. But was it? Had the freedom to create the ability to live without financial fear been a luxury underwritten by ruthless exploitation? The thought made her feel nauseous. Julian, in his pathetic, grubby desperation, may have stumbled upon a truth more devastating than his own infidelity. The possibility that the man who had just played the role of her avenging angel was in fact a villain on a far grander scale was an agony that dwarfed all others. When Daniel's call came the next afternoon, requesting her presence in the library, Elara felt as though she were walking to her own sentencing. She had fortified herself with a cold, brittle resolve. She would not be a pawn in anyone's game any longer, not Julian's, and not even her father's. She needed the unvarnished truth, no matter how ugly. She entered the library to find them waiting, the room charged with a tense, final energy. The scent of old leather and her father's expensive scotch hung in the air. Alistair sat behind his massive desk, a monolith of calm, while Daniel stood beside him, a laptop open and glowing. "His calls are becoming erratic," Daniel said, his tone grim. "He's on the edge. It's time to end this." "Before you end it with him, you end it with me," Elara said, her voice cutting through the quiet. She walked forward until she was standing on the opposite side of the desk from her father, creating a battlefield between them. "I will not be protected or placated. I want to see the contents of that drive. Then I want you, father, to look me in the eye and tell me what part of it is true." Alistair's gaze was intense, analytical. He seemed to be weighing her, measuring the new steel in her voice. After a long, unnerving silence, he gave a curt nod to Daniel. "Show your client the evidence against her family." Daniel turned the laptop to face her. The file directory for Project Nightingale was stark against the screen. Elara's hand trembled slightly as she used the trackpad, her fingers feeling cold and numb. She clicked open a document titled Phase 1 Analysis, Sub-Saharan Logistics. It was filled with cold corporate prose, detailing how to leverage political instability to create choke points in shipping, artificially inflating the value of commodities Vance Global controlled. She opened another file, a simulated email chain between two of her father's senior executives, coldly discussing the acceptable percentages of collateral market damage. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt sullied just by reading it. Collateral market damage. She read aloud the phrase, tasting like ash in her mouth. "Is that what we call destroying livelihoods now?" She looked up from the screen, her eyes blazing with a pain that was deeper than anger. "This is what you do. This is the global logistics you've been so vague about all my life. Is my ability to paint pictures of flowers paid for with this filth?" For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in her father's iron composure. Not guilt, but a deep, ancient weariness. He let her accusation hang in the air, allowing its full weight to be felt before he spoke. No, he said, his voice flat and absolute. It is not. He gestured to the screen. What you are looking at is a work of fiction. It is a ghost story written by my security division 7 years ago. It is a carefully engineered lie designed to be found. He rose from his chair and walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her. Elara, you must understand. Wealth of our magnitude is not a fortress. It is a beacon. It attracts people. Some are good, many are ambitious, and a few are predators. Julian was a predator of the weakest sort, driven by insecurity. When I had him vetted before your wedding, my team flagged him as a high-risk liability. It meant that if his ambition was ever thwarted, his character was weak enough that he would seek revenge. He would try to harm you and through you this family and this company. He explained it all then, the chilling, brilliant foresight of it all. Project Nightingale was a honeypot, a digital trap laced with just enough truth to be plausible. The isolated server, the specific technical jargon, the names of real executives, all were elements of a sophisticated deception. My chief of staff, Alistair continued, mentioned the name Nightingale on a phone call in my study one evening when you were visiting. It was a calculated risk, a seed planted in the subconscious. We theorized that under stress you might murmur it, and Julian, ever the opportunist, heard it. The private investigator he hired to breach our servers was a guppy swimming into a whale's mouth. My cybersecurity team monitored his every keystroke. They led him directly to the folder, let him download our ghost story, and then sealed, the door behind him. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. Julian hadn't been an adversary. He had been a test subject in a multi-year experiment, and he had failed in the exact manner they had predicted. The relief that washed over Elara was so immense it almost brought her to her knees, but it was quickly followed by a chilling awe. "It is time," Alistair repeated softly, returning to his desk. Daniel nodded, his expression hardening back into professional resolve. He picked up his phone and activated the speaker. The call connected on the first ring. "Took you long enough," Julian snapped, his voice thin and frayed with anxiety. "I'm done waiting. Either I get a wire confirmation in the next 10 minutes, or the Wall Street Journal gets a call." "There will be no wire, Julian," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm level. "I'm calling to offer you some free legal counsel. Yesterday you confessed on a federally secured line to several felonies. Let's start with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Your PI's unauthorized access to our servers carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. Then there's the attempt to extort, which is another 5. Since you attempted to extort a multinational corporation, we can add wire fraud to the list. That's 20 more. Are you following so far?" A strangled noise came from the speaker. You can't prove any of that. It's a lie. We have the PI's complete digital footprint from the moment he entered our server," Daniel countered smoothly. "We have the recording of you confessing, and we have the Project Nightingale data, which has been logged as evidence with federal authorities. You are caught, Julian. The game is over." "No." Julian's voice cracked, devolving into a desperate plea. Elara, please, I know you're there. Don't let them do this. We had good years. We loved each other. We can fix this, just you and me. We can go away." Elara stepped forward, her shadow falling across the phone on the desk. All the pain, the humiliation, the love and the lies of the past 7 years crystallized into a single, cold point of clarity. She was no longer his victim. She was no longer the quiet artist. She was the woman he had fatally misjudged. "You were a bad investment, Julian," she said, her voice clear and steady, imbued with the icy authority of her father. "And my family always cuts its losses." The silence on the other end was absolute, broken only by a sharp, defeated intake of breath. Daniel delivered the terms of surrender. "A courier is en route to you with an NDA. It will bind you to total unconditional silence for the remainder of your natural life. You will leave New York. You will never again work in finance. You will relinquish all data. If you break the terms, the penalties are not financial. They are designed to ensure your complete and utter ruin. You have one choice, a life of silent obscurity or a life in prison. Decide." He ended the call. The silence that filled the library was no longer tense, but clean, purged. Julian Hayes and the ghost of Elara Thompson he had tried to create were gone forever. Elara looked at her father, seeing him not just as a parent, but as a sovereign of a complex, dangerous world. All this intricate trap, just to protect me. "The world is not your art studio, Elara," he said, his gaze softening. "It is filled with men like him. This power," he gestured around the room at the city beyond the window, "is your birthright. It can be a burden, or it can be a shield. The choice of how you wield it has always been yours." In that moment, she understood. Hiding from her name had been its own kind of prison. She would no longer be just the artist, nor just the heiress. She would be both. She would return to her studio, to her sanctuary. But her work would be different now. It would be infused with this terrifying, complicated truth. Her art would have a spine of steel, and her first new piece, she knew, would be a massive canvas. A maelstrom of the most brilliant, audacious, and unapologetic canary yellow, the color of a sun that was finally gloriously rising on her own terms. In the end, it wasn't the money or the power that truly defeated Julian and Chloe. It was their own arrogance. They underestimated the quiet woman at the table, never imagining the fortress of loyalty and foresight that stood behind her. Elara's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silent, calculated move that changes the entire game. It's about reclaiming your name, your power, and your own story from those who tried to write you out of it. If Elara's journey from quiet wife to empowered woman resonated with you, and if you believe that betrayal should always meet its consequences, then please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the story. Share it with someone who loves a tale of epic justice, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories of intrigue, drama, and ultimate triumph coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.